we show how regulatory frameworks constrain participation in designing a platform for community radio. Community radio is generally assumed to be owned, managed and run by volunteers and to provide a not-for-profit alternative to mainstream services and access and training to marginalised people. However, actually, stations are limited to communities with access to resources because production and broadcast hardware and licensed software to schedule and manage radio content is costly, and users of production and broadcast technologies are often technically skilled activists or people pursuing careers. And design has not focused on widening inclusion. We sought to refine a software platform, Routio, to have reduced the barriers for rural communities to establish their own radio stations and use radio to animate local public spheres and engage people in discussing issues, particularly around sustainability. Routio replaces operations usually performed by specialised equipment and supports scheduling and hosting programs in a distributed and peer-to-peer way. Volunteers upload and schedule content via the web, which Routio transfers to a smartphone that interfaces with an antenna. It was first implemented in rural Uganda, and we intended to refine the functional software to suit different rural communities. In this paper, we discuss stations in 4 places, which we give pseudonyms. In Ireland, we worked with a community development organisation on West Island, which launched a station in early 2019. This organisation prompted 2 others to coordinate to share another station between 2 islands, which launched a year later. About 500, often older people, live permanently on the 3 islands, but their populations can treble in the summer, so islanders are concerned about declining population numbers and sustaining local ways of life, and they hope their radio stations might persist knowledge about their cultures and histories and assist cohesion and older people's isolation. Most of the radio's staff and volunteers are islanders, though some also live on the mainland. Most were over 50 and not motivated to embark on radio careers, but the West Island team also included people with experience in TV and radio journalism, sound engineering, and from a neighbouring community radio station. None of the 4 of us at the local university had experience with radio. 2 of us were involved at the project start, 1 came a year later, and I joined after 2 years and lived on one of the islands for 2 months. One of the authors focused on the Romanian case and interacted with NGOs that support freedom of expression, media education and communication, and journalism in healthcare. Because obtaining licences in Romania involves complex interactions with national authorities for spectrum, the NGOs did not engage with the inhabitants of the 2 villages where the stations were launched until after they had obtained their licence. The villages have 600 and 2,800 inhabitants, are difficult to access, especially during winter, and inhabitants welcome the radio for connecting them to news outside as well as livelihood-specific content on fishing, forestry, farming and tourism. Teams of volunteers for the stations recorded content, got involved in social media related to the stations, and some local men with experience in internet and engineering provided support. We analysed qualitative data generated over 2.5 years from when the project began at the different sites. We envisaged that by integrating Routio into setting up and running the small stations, the local radio teams would express their needs in refining it. We did not anticipate how applying for and complying with legal use of spectrum would determine their participation and platform design. Licence frameworks shaped imagining what and who the platform would support. The NGOs and development organisations interacted with the Irish and Romanian institutions to enable licensed use of the frequencies. Romania lacks a specific policy for community radio, but Ireland has a rich heritage of community radio, and the Broadcasting Association offers a temporary licence for communities which want to try out having a station by broadcasting on 30 days in a year. However, even applying for temporary licences ordered design. From the start, the islanders imagined their stations and broadcasts in relation to the licence application. The complex process in Romania explicitly directed design goals because the application required functionality to create accurate and precise program schedules. The content of applications required knowledge about spectrum law and transmission equipment, which demanded involving people with particular expertise. This determined who planned the stations and contributed to expert layperson relations, and in turn, the imaginary that shaped design. The applications required stating intentions about programming, which prevented exploring ideas by gaining familiarity by doing broadcasting and involving listeners in feedback. It constrained any spirit of experimentation or iteratively refining the platform. The application processes also demand significant coordination, which promoted certain organisational structures and divisions of labour. Assumptions in the applications for station managers, for example, works against the peer-to-peer approach Routio aims to support. And it was difficult at first for Romanian authorities to even visualise a station that could comprise only the transmitter and a phone. In fact, a studio was part of the attraction for the Islanders teams, even though an application for a licence requires a studio only if applicants intend to later apply for a 100-day licence. Nonetheless, studio-less broadcasting made it possible to remotely support the launch of the two stations, and especially during COVID-19's lockdowns. Once obtained, complying with licences influenced design priorities and participation. The Islanders prioritised accumulating sufficient content that conformed to the description in their application and to fill the hours prior to launching stations. Romania's local commercial licence requires 24/7 broadcasting, which is a huge commitment for a community radio station. Thus, emphasis was put on integrating an automatic text-to-speech feature to produce regular updates, such as weather forecasts. This feature was valuable for government communications after the COVID-19 pandemic. Mainly, though, the developers had to focus on stability, which eliminated time for training and feedback from a range of users. Licence compliance promoted an emphasis on professionalism, which reinforced assumptions that broadcasts are products and listeners are consumers, and this limited exploring different prototypes. The Romanian regulators actually commented that the programmes are better than those offered by many existing commercial radio, but the NGOs felt obliged to achieve quality. The wording for the temporary licence in Ireland is ambiguous, and the islanders varied in feeling compelled to achieve a consistent first-class service. Perspective on who was involved in decisions also differed in the islands. For instance, while one member was reluctant for decisions to be discussed by a colour of the paint committee, another was eager for inclusivity. But divisions of labour hardened. Some resulted from equipment introduced by expert team members, which was complex for non-experts to use. Other divisions related to the way the licence limits the number of people involved in setting up transmission equipment and how this infrastructure coincided with gender. And overall, more women undertook admin roles than men. Thus, regulatory frameworks promote certain expectations that work against diverse participation in design. And they show that designers must be more actively account for how regulations embed purposes and values in new technologies. Thus, we advocate that designers assume roles in regulatory debate and translate their expertise in shaping policy. We thank our partners and participants.